Someone's asking this, I'm not sure you can answer it. How did the police and government not notice that the application of trans rights did not protect against male violence, but it was applied as against women? I'm not sure what that means. Okay, well, we'll move on from there. Unless we get a clarification.
I think they did notice. I think they didn't care.
They did notice, they didn't care. Okay, yeah. And yeah, because women and gay men and lesbians and feminists were not attacking people.
No.
Yeah. Except maybe, criticizing, which is perfectly reasonable in a society. And so here's a couple of other questions. I think it's 7 years. Somebody's asking how long did it take for the case with the recent Supreme ruling between the initial filing and judgment? Oh, you said you filed first in 2020.
Yes, but that is because we had 2 judicial reviews.
Yes.
So that was the first one we won in 2022. Okay. And then we had to go back in 2022 and take the second one. So it's been 5 years all told on the same piece of legislation.
Okay. And do you think that having somewhat like a particular focus, doing it that way, is that something you'd recommend to other regions?
I think the point about using that piece of legislation was it gave us a key to open the door, because there was nothing specific, and this was the problem, that everything was obfuscated and nobody really wanted to address what these pieces of paper meant, what it could have been. Parliament could have said something. Parliament could have laid down a statutory instrument and said, just to clear everything up, this is what it means. But they didn't. And if you listen to them, they would keep saying things like, oh, the Equality Act protects single-sex spaces. And then they go away and say trans women are women. So you never had anything straight coming from them. And I think because this piece of legislation very explicitly stated first that sex and entitlement to a sex-based right was based on self-identification. And then when that was struck down, they used the certificated sex route.
Right.
And because there was nothing else, there hadn't been any other pieces of legislation passed that said that. See, if they'd have just left it as this is a measure for women, the trans lobby groups would have been in there arguing to all the organisations, you have to include trans women in this, and they'd have all been confused and they wouldn't have known, but there would have been nothing we could have pinned the government on. So it was their determination to be so explicit that actually gave us the way in. And then because equal representation measures are they are only allowable because of the Equality Act, it had to go back to the definition in the Equality Act. So it was a great way in.
Right. And we too in Canada have both sex, unlike Australia that doesn't have sex protected at all anymore. In Canada, we still have sex, and we have gender. I don't know how many versions of gender identity, gender expression, various things. So this is coming for us too, for sure, on different levels. And I think different groups are already, some are moving towards, there's already a challenge about women in prison here in Canada. Another group is doing, which is great. And there are things that people are working on. Many of us are working on different ways in to get this to happen. But a couple of things people have been asking here that came up. What arguments did For Women Scotland make for the court to rule that women is based on sex and that's definable? Was there a particular way that you...
Well, there were a few, and there were a few moments in court that were quite entertaining. And one of them was the interlude with the pregnant man.
Mm.
This was actually a journey that the Scottish government took us on.
Yeah.
Because, well, I don't think they intended to, but our Casey Aidan had said about the absurdity of if you read woman in the Equality Act as meaning biological females and anyone with a certificate who was male, and excluding anyone with a certificate who was female, it would mean that when trans-identified women, trans men, get pregnant, they would lose their protections for maternity.
Right.
So the next day, the Scottish government launched into this conversation about the pregnant man, and it went round and round in circles a little bit. And I think the conclusion they came to was that when the Equality Act was drafted, they wouldn't have considered these women would want to have children. But of course, they are having children, and it's a biological possibility. So you can't say when they wouldn't have, they've decided they wouldn't do it. The other thing that they eventually said was, well, that section of the Equality Act needs to be rewritten. So they conceded that their reading of the Equality Act meant that it was incomprehensible and flawed.
Right.
So, I mean, Aidan went right back actually to the reasons why we had to have a sex-based category in law. All the sort of the presumption in law was against women, and so he said that this had to be corrected, and if there's a necessity to have it corrected, it has to be based on something that's definable and reasonable. And the other thing that was of interest to the court was that under there's a category of gender reassignment, and that covers both men and women who identify as the opposite sex. And it covers people with a certificate and without a certificate. But of course, what would happen under their reading was that the people with a certificate had different sets of rights than the people without the certificate. And the Supreme Court said that that wasn't equitable either, that you couldn't have a protected characteristic where there were different bands within it. Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. Someone's asking, is there any way that any of the governments involved, I guess that could be Scotland or England, or could introduce other legislation and try to, like, I think there are people already trying to do this. Is that not true? Or try to introduce other types of legislation like gender recognition or gender identity or something like that. Is that possible given the ruling? And are people doing that regardless of whether it's possible?
I think it would be very difficult for them to, because Scotland did pass gender recognition reform.
Yes.
To allow self-ID.
Right.
That was passed in our parliament. And then the Scottish Secretary at Westminster blocked it, used an unprecedented mechanism in the Scotland Act and said no, because it affects UK-wide equality law.
Right.
There are still, I think the Labour government still say they are committed to reforming the gender recognition process.
This is under Keir Starmer's leadership.
But of course, we know now that these certificates are not going to give them the rights that they think they will give them.
Right.
So they might do that. There are still problems around gender recognition certificates because they do allow people to change their birth certificate, and they also have a level of secrecy built in. They allow you to hide your past existence. So there are still issues with that, and I think that if they did go down that route, those things would be challenged. I don't know how much political will there would be to try to do it after some of the things that have happened. But I think the problem is there are so many people who are so dogmatic on the other side of the argument that I think political leaders often want an easy life. There was an issue this week with the data bill. There's a data bill going through Parliament at the moment, and it's to have some government recognised app where your data is stored digitally, and you can use it, instead of producing your passport or your driving license, and you only have to show the parts of information that they need. So if somebody needs your age to buy a bottle of wine, you can just call that up and say, there's my government approved digital identity that says I'm over 18. But the problem with that is that they rejected an amendment to ensure that sex was based on biology. And that's an issue, because if you're allowing people to falsify that data on a government approved site, and then there's a requirement to know someone's sex for the Equality Act, which says it has to be biological, you've got this issue, because somebody could be presenting this and saying, but the government says I'm a woman, the government's let me say I'm a woman. That I would imagine when that goes to the Lords will boot that back. So
we certainly have that here. We have driver's licenses and passports and everything people can change. I could go in there and change mine without any documentation of any kind. So there's a lot to beat back here too, for sure. There's a question here from Kathleen. How are you able to find lawyers who could understand the feminist perspective on sex and equality law? Did you have to teach willing lawyers from scratch, or were there some willing to take on the issue out of their own interest? And do you know what enabled them to take courage and step outside of the professional culture, which I imagine was not friendly?
I think, the lawyers like to have a good case. And we got some very good lawyers. And I'm not quite sure how we found Cindy, our solicitor, at first. But they do deal with this, human rights areas of law. And they've been excellent. But yes, and then we hired Aidan as our KC, because he understood these issues and around, and he had argued, he had done the Freddie McConnell case, which was a biological woman who had a gender recognition certificate to say she was male, who did get pregnant, had a baby, and wanted the child's birth certificate to record the fact that she was its father. And Aidan actually represented her. And so one of the things we thought was that it's always good to have a lawyer who can see all parts of this. But as we've gone on, we've worked really, really closely with them. And Trina, my co-director, who spotted all of this, and she spotted the main argument that we made for what, because in the Gender Recognition Act, it says that a GRC changes a person's sex for all purposes. And that's the bit everyone's taken out. It says for all purposes, but there's another section underneath that which says except. And Trina picked that out and said, I think this line about, it said, unless modified by other pieces of legislation. And she said, I think this is the bit we need. And I think at first the lawyers were going, no, we can't. I don't think we can make that. And then they came back and went, actually, you know what, you are right. So that was great. And yeah, and Aidan gradually got into all his feminism. And honestly, we've not been telling him this, but he went.
He did his own work.
Read it all up and was there in the court, you know.
Oh, good.
Writing on about the patriarchy. So
okay. And now, do those certificates still exist? And what do they say on them now? They have the exceptions. Is that it, or?
So you can still get a gender recognition certificate, and it is in some ways what they claimed it was. It's a bit of admin. It changes your sex for your documentations, for your birth certificate, marriage certificate, death certificate. It was introduced really because our time did not want to introduce same-sex marriage. So it was a way that transsexuals could get married if they were. And you know, why do that first? Because they'd gone to the European Court of Human Rights. A trans woman had gone to the European Court of Human Rights because arguing about the marriage and also about pensions, because at that time there were unequal pension provisions and women got their pensions earlier than men, and this individual wanted to be able to claim a pension earlier. And the European Court of Human Rights ruled that yes, that there had to be a mechanism for doing this. And that was when they didn't have to do something that changed somebody's sex, but they didn't want to bring in same-sex marriage. So they said, this changes your sex. And that's where all the problems have come from. And so, yes, technically, it's still there, and it's still saying your sex has changed. And so somebody would have to know that you had a GRC, and that's why you were recorded as female. So it's still difficult. It's still going to be difficult for people to prove what's going on.
Are those documents accepted if you're arrested? Would they arrest you as a female charged with a crime? Because I know that's an issue there too, is the statistics and the crime statistics.
It has been, and they were recording everything on self-ID. You know, there's 9,000 people with a GRC in the UK, so it's a very small number. But the issue was that they would do, and like in Canada, people can change their passports and their birth certificates. They don't have to have a GRC to do this. So there's a lot. So the kind of documentation that you might have to provide to prove who you were, that's easily falsifiable still. And you don't have to have a gender recognition certificate in order to do it. So the issue is now, I suppose, how do we get back into documentation this idea that you have to have some reference or some link back to your natal sex? Right.
And have you been able to raise all the money you've needed? You haven't had to cover it yourself. You've gotten public donations, right?
Yeah. So we, after our first win in 2022, we got back costs from the government, not the whole thing, but a large chunk of it. And so we then recycled that back into the second one. So I think we got about just under £150,000 back in costs from that first one, and we would probably had spent about 50,000 more than that, and we'd raised all that money by crowd justice. Just public donations, and I worked out it was something like an average of £35 per donation.
Yeah, that's great.
Then when we'd spent all that for this one, we had to raise more. So this one we've spent it was over £400,000.
Wow. For the Supreme Court challenge.
It's a lot of money.
So the lawyers are getting paid. Your lawyers are getting paid.
Yeah.
There's court costs. and filing costs and other things. Yeah.
Yes. So,
and did you, in terms of the lawyers again, because a couple of different people are asking questions about lawyers, because there's an interest in Canada to find some lawyers, at least whether they start out as feminists and have a feminist perspective on sex and equality law, lawyers that might be interested in boning up on that kind of education and taking it on with that kind of knowledge, because the nuances and the details really are very specific. And the woman that you mentioned, a woman that was your lawyer, and also a man. And was she someone that was considered a feminist lawyer? Was she?
I don't think so, not particularly. I mean, there are quite a lot of lawyers in the UK generally, and who you've probably seen online, who are very, good on all this stuff, very hot on it all. And obviously, Joanna Cherry, who was an MP, is also a KC. Yeah. And so there's quite a sort of thriving gender critical legal, and I think because a lot of them are interested in ideas and in conflicts within the law. And this was such a knotty problem, and had been such a knotty problem for a very long time. There were so many different opinions on how you were to interpret this, that it was a real kind of talking point for a lot of the lawyers. And so I think there was an interest in it.
Right. And we're hoping that in part because of that case, your case, is that there are people here too, I think, that are interested. They haven't really, most of them haven't taken on a case. And I'm thinking about feminist lawyers here, or people that are interested in feminism, or learning about it, or being able to speak from that perspective on sex and equality law, because it's something that feminists really fought for. I think that this case might inspire or embolden, encourage others to see that this can be done in a country like ours as well. Because
because the lawyers afterwards, and I some of it's quite a big group of lawyers who they were enjoying it lots, but they were all working for the different interveners as well.
Yeah.
And they were saying that it's common law, so it will have an impact in Canada and Australia, and so it does have an impact.
Yes, yeah, we're thrilled about that, and we might be able to ride on your coattails to some degree, or work hard and struggle on your coattails for 5 years and maybe get this to happen here. A couple more questions. Well, somebody asked if you have any advice for us in Canada, which is a big question, but do you have any?
Oh, I would say find those bits you can challenge, because even if it's a small one, if you tug it, we got a win the week after the ruling as well on schools, because we got parents who are prepared to take their school to court over their toilet provisions, changing facilities, so on, in their primary school. And they won that, and the declarator then affects all the schools in Scotland. So now all the schools in Scotland have to follow this. So that's, I think, and that's why I say this was a very obscure piece of legislation, but it gave us the entry into the wider equality law. So find those areas where you have clarity and you can really go and challenge. And if it's individuals that you need to that need to take a challenge against a school or the police or something, do that.
Do those school parents, does that affect the education that children are being taught as well, or just the bathroom facility? It does.
No, it has been. There's been some awful stuff going into schools, so that all needs to be sorted out as well.
Yes, yeah, for sure. And someone wants to know what the change you've noticed in the UK press is. There been positive change? I know there's been annoying change, focusing on the poor people now that are affected by this in a negative way. But have you seen some positive change?
I think, we've been working for a long time and quite closely with journalists, especially based in Scotland. We've got really good relationship with a lot of them.
Right.
We got to the point where quite a few of the journalists at some of the big papers would ring us and go, "Have you got a story for us? Can you give us a story?" And so that's been great. So we've developed those relationships. We've developed relationships with some of the local TV reporters as well here, because Scotland's small. What we didn't have, and we were still quite disappointed with, is some of the bigger shows. So some of the bigger news programs, like the Today program or
Right.
PM on these are all on Radio 4, but they're the big kind of radio
Right.
newsy stories, or
Right.
Newsnight on the TV.
Right.
We thought they should have been covering this, and there's still a nervousness, I think, at sort of national level about covering a lot of these stories. I think it is getting better. I did go on Woman's Hour.
Yes, I heard. Yeah.
Which is quite a big thing for
BBC, right? That's BBC.
Yes, but I think people felt it was a little bit prickly. I mean, I don't mind that, but
no.
I think there is still a nervousness, and it's annoying because, of course, the BBC is so hugely trusted,
Yes.
and it makes a big difference having that proper representation there. And that's been one of the disappointments for me, because I used to get all my news either from the BBC or the Guardian, which was the more liberal newspaper.
Yeah. Sure.
And they just weren't covering it.
Right.
And so it has been the centre, or I wouldn't say that, I don't really think Britain has a kind of rampant right-wing press particularly, but some people will say that it is, but I don't think it is. It's pretty middle of the road.
Yeah, but you're accepting invitations to most of the people who ask you on, I imagine, are you?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it has been a bit trickier, but yeah, we tried.
Yeah, good. That's great. Well, we're getting close to our time. I'm going to take one more question here that just popped up. Someone asking how they're not clear how this will work on the ground. So if a trans identified man is taken to a prison and he has documentation to say he's a woman, will they be able to place him in a women's prison or a men's prison now? Is that changed? Is there anything like how the logistics work?
Okay, so under the law, whatever someone's documentation say, if you know that they are a biological man, that is their sex for the purposes of the Equality Act. And something like a prison is so how the Equality Act works is it starts from a top-down premise: you're not allowed to discriminate against anyone. But in certain circumstances, you are allowed to provide separate provision for people on the basis of sex. And this may be equal provision, or it may be only for one sex because the other sex doesn't need it. So you only have to provide cervical smear tests for women because men don't need them. And something like prisons would be in the category where you have determined that it meets the threshold that you need those separate facilities for safety.
Right.
as well as privacy and dignity, and that it meets the threshold for a single-sex environment. And under the ruling, that says that in that case, you cannot have anyone who is of the opposite sex in there, because at that point, it stops being a single-sex facility.
Right.
And it would just undermine the whole reason you have a single-sex space.
Right.
So it shouldn't be to do with their documentation. It should be to do with their sex. Now, with prison, I would imagine if someone's going to prison, you would know all about them, so you would know what sex they were. Yeah. Practically, I don't think, I think if we always talk about mythical passing trans women, but there are a few people, I suppose, who you might not know what sex they were, and especially some of the women who might have grown a beard or something. Mm-hmm. And so practically, I imagine if you're out in town and there are some people who'll go into the loos and maybe you wouldn't know. Mm-hmm. And nobody is going to be checking documentation on the door. Right. And that's, I suppose, how it always used to work. But that's the same sort of thing I always say, that nobody checks your driver's license when you get into the car. Nobody checks your insurance. They just presume that you will obey the law.
That's right.
And I think that for other areas, if you have reason to believe that person is a man, you can take steps to establish what's going on there.
And so are the men that are currently in women's prisons there being moved out? Do you know?
No, not as far as we're aware. So, and actually, so down south, the last government, the UK government, did start to move on it. The Scottish government's position, the Scottish Prison Services position rather, is that they wouldn't put a man in a women's prison if he'd been convicted of violence against women. But I mean, that's because most people are not convicted who commit violence against women. So how would you know, for one?
That's right.
And also, they've got murderers in there who've sexually tortured and murdered men, and we're supposed to believe that they wouldn't hurt a woman. I find that quite extraordinary. So there probably aren't many at the moment, but those who are in there are very dangerous individuals. And we know they've caused a lot of trauma to women. So
they're breaking the law at this point, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that will be easier than starting from scratch. Now that will be able to be addressed through challenge.
And any woman in that situation who's in that space with them will be able to make a claim against the Scottish Prison Service. Right. And at some point they probably will.
Yes, I imagine so. Yes. As I know, I was reading, I guess written by, there's a woman who wrote, I think, in The Women Who Wouldn't Wish, who was a prison administrator of prison. Yeah. And she did talk about, in men's prisons, there is a separate place for trans women because they might be at risk, but they can have their own lockdown in their own place away from the men who don't identify as women. So, they can be protected. There's many ways people can be protected.
That's right. Because there's lots of men who are vulnerable in prison.
Yeah.
Young men, old men, gay men, disabled men.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they are not all saying, I need to be in a women's prison because I'm vulnerable. So the prison service it has a responsibility to these people to look after them.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're hoping that might be one of the changes that we can look forward to in Canada, since there's an ongoing challenge. And do you have anything else you want to add before I let you go and have your evening?
I don't think so. It's been really lovely to speak to you all.
Yeah.
Just really good luck, because I know the prison service in Canada has been awful. It was one of the ones that, scary.
For sure. And there's not the support they used to have from organizations that were set up to support them either. That, the Elizabeth Fry Society was set up to support females in women's institutions, and they don't on this issue because they have decided to believe that trans women are actual women and go in the prisons. So, you know, the structures that were there before are not there now, the supports.
Yeah.
And so women have set up their own support systems, of course, as we women do. And there were some people working really hard on that issue. So, but before I thank you, Susan, I just want to say thank you to everybody that attended the webinar, and sorry again for the glitches and the slow start. If you like the website, if you are not on our mailing list now, go to our website and ask to be on the mailing list. And if you're able to, you can ask how you can make a donation. We have a bank account, we have expenses, so we'd appreciate help with our costs. Our webinars are recorded and posted online. Well, we'll see how this one turned out. Hopefully we'll be able to use it. We post it on our website. So we'll let you know and if you have friends, family, colleagues who aren't here today, hopefully they can view this online in a week or two. And now I'd like to thank Susan Smith. I know you've been inundated with interviews over the past few weeks, and we really appreciate that you agreed to speak with us today. And with the time change, I know it's Saturday night, and now you can go and put your feet up and have your tea. Oh, yes. And so thank you from all of us. Thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for coming and talking to us about it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye.
Good night, Susan. Bye, everybody.